Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is the Casual Friday podcast. In this week's podcast, I have two completed projects, including one that I designed myself, and it's finished at February. So I'll talk about what progress I've made already. So let's get started. So a couple of weeks ago, I showed you a sock I had knit that has a replaceable sock heel. It's called the Aladdin heel, and it was published in Beehive stock books it's a Canadian brand, back in the 1940s, late 1940s. And I've knit a second sock with a replaceable heel this week. It uses the same basic construction, but with a difference. All of these came from an invention by a woman named Nora Jarvis Allen. So I want to show you the socks and tell you a little bit about them, and then I want to tell you something about Nora herself and her patents. So you might recognize this sock right here. I was showing this to you last time. It was the first sock of an actual pair I was going to knit. The pairs don't match each other. This is part of my long-term project to look at the evolution of socks and stockings. And previously I've been doing other centuries, like I did a Tudor era stocking. I did one from the 17th century. I reverse engineered a 19th century stocking that had belonged to the great-grandmother of the woman who possessed that stocking. So that's what I've been looking at before, and I've been doing one sock of the pair because I don't learn anything from the second sock, and I'm not going to wear these. So for this sock, I actually did want to knit two of them, but they're not a matching pair. This one's got what's called a regulation length leg. It's 11 inches from the top of the heel flap all the way up. It goes roughly to the top of the calf, and maybe not all the way up to like the knee, but up to the top of the calf. And then the second one is more of what's called a slack length. It's like the typical length that would end right at the bulge of your calf muscle. You can knit this in the same circumference for the entire leg, right before the point where you would have to do some kind of shaping, where this sock was knit so that once you got up to this length right here, which is as far as I can go without shaping, this one had more stitches. So this is 64 stitches here, but this had 72 for the ribbing. So that would go over the calf muscle and stretch, which I thought was really interesting. So these socks use what is called the Aladdin heel. And it's a replaceable heel flap and heel turn. And so this was patented back during World War II by a woman named Nora Jarvis Allen through Patons Baldwin, that is a yarn company. They're headquartered in the UK, but they had North American divisions. They had one in Canada, and then they had one in the US as well. So Nora Jarvis Allen is a woman of mystery to me. She served during World War II in the Royal Canadian Navy, the Wrens, which is the women's division. She was a lieutenant. I don't know if Jarvis was a maiden name and Allen was her married name. I don't know if married women were allowed to serve in the military during World War II. I can't find anything. I did genealogical research on her. I could not find her in census records for sure. I couldn't find her, birth, marriage, death record. I couldn't find anything else about her outside of World War II when she was in the newspapers fairly often. She did not get into the newspaper because of this patent, though. So she came up with three approaches for creating this replaceable heel. The one that she described as preferable was that when you got down to the heel flap, you would do the heel flap and the heel turn like you normally would, but then you would cut the yarn. And then you would work across all of the heel stitches with a length of contrast yarn. And then you would cast on, so like using a backwards loop, you'd cast on to create the edge of this gusset. So this opening, this would remain an edge here with the heel. You wouldn't pick up the stitches. You would instead cast on. and then you would do the same thing over here. Then you would continue working in the round and you would do your gusset decreases, and then later on you would come back and get a length of contrast yarn and you would sew those two edges together. So you'd have a cast on edge and you'd have a selvage and you would sew them together. And you would do it with a contrasting yarn. I did it with yellow so it would be very visible. You would sew it together and then you would know when you wanted to replace the heel where to take those stitches off. So you would take these stitches off, capture the live stitches on the sole, and then you could rip back the heel. You know, you could cut out this yarn as well on the side. You'd rip back the heel, re-knit the heel, and then graft it to those live stitches, and then you'd re-sew it again. So that was what she described as the preferred method. And there's not a bulky seam here because it's a backward loop cast on, and the edge, the selvage edge here is a garter stitch bump, and so you can easily sew into the bump at the edge and then sew along that backwards loop bind up. It certainly isn't any bulkier than if you had picked up stitches. If I'm pressing on this and I can't feel anything. I wanted to use one of the other options for the second sock. I didn't have enough yarn to make the regulation length anyway, so that was another reason to do the slack length and just be able to compare what the sock lengths were. What was done in this sock was, again, you would have, you'd work across in your contrast yarn, but then you would take a different length of contrast yarn, separate one, and you would pick up stitches along this garter bump edge with the contrast yarn. And you would do that over here as well, so that you would have stitches picked up over here, stitches picked up over here, and then you'd have stitches on the needle here. And at that point, you would join in the middle of the sole with your regular yarn, and then you would knit and do all of your gussets. So one of the methods, actually, once you've got all of this done, they have you take out this contrast yarn right here, bind off the stitches along the gusset, and then re-sew them together so that when you're taking this apart, you don't have live stitches that you have to capture over here. So you may be wondering how I know that it was Nora Jarvis Allen who invented this replaceable sock heel. The clues I got came from these Beehive sock books where I first found them. And it says in this one, patent pending, and it says in this one, an application for patent has been filed, and tells people if you're going to use this, you know, in some other way other than knitting personally for yourself using Beehive yarns, then you need to obtain a license. So I wondered if the patent had ever been actually awarded for this particular sock. So I started searching around for patent, you know, Aladdin sock patent or Aladdin heel patent. Couldn't find anything. So I looked for Patons and Baldwin patents, and there weren't very many of them. The one that I found was for the United States Patent Office. So these booklets are Canadian, and this is Beehive is a Canadian yarn brand that was part of Patons and Baldwin. Patons is a UK company. But I found this United States patent, and it has her name here, Nora Jarvis Allen, Toronto, Ontario. And then it indicates that she is assigned the rights to Patons and Baldwin. It has all the really dry explanation of how this works. And it has some diagrams on the back. If you've ever tried reading a patent, it's really hard. And I mean, I know how to knit socks, and I was like, okay, really had to pay attention in reading this pattern. Barbara, who is the archivist at the Knitting and Crochet Guild of the UK, sent me this patent. It's got, you know, a bunch of different dates in here when things were applied or specified. And so this is a provisional specification that was, I think, added to the original patent, because otherwise it's pretty much worded exactly like the one that I saw in the US, but there's additional specification at the beginning. And what this is an actual pattern. Like, it's a written sock pattern that explains how to knit the sock and put the actual heel into it. So I don't know if that was just something about the UK offices like this that makes no sense. You've got to do something to make it clearer, or what. The images, the drawings that they include in this one are different from the ones in the US patent. I mean, they're very similar, but this looks more like some kind of an engraving or something. So it's just different how this is illustrated. But it really bugged me that I couldn't find the Canadian patent. And I finally found the Canadian Patent Office stuff online, and the patent itself wasn't available to look at, but there were documents associated. There was a PDF associated with it, and I got a copy of that. And this is like the actual application typewritten, and then it has these drawings on the back. And again, they seem to be slightly different than the ones that were submitted for each of the other ones. They show all of the same information. They're just physically different drawings. But I was really happy to find this original one. And the way it's written, my invention relates to a method of knitting socks, yada yada, indicating it's a specific person. But her name isn't mentioned anywhere here in the Canadian application. There's no signature of her in here, and it shows at the bottom that this is Patons Baldwin's Limited, applicant by some guy who is their attorney. I'm really happy that I found or was given all three of these patents for the different countries. So I have been asked by viewers in the past if there was a way to knit a sock with a heel flap and gusset construction where the heel flap was replaceable. So part of what interested me about this Aladdin sock is understanding how that construction process works, and then I could decide if it made sense to make a video. So I will make a video about this construction sometime in the spring if that is something that is of interest to you. One of the things I love about knitting is that there are endless opportunities to learn new things. And one of the ways that I learn new things is just through the process of designing something. So hats I think of as being fairly easy to design, but they have some interesting challenges to them. One is, the easy part is it's, usually less than 100 grams of yarn. This hat here with the double rim has, I think, 65 grams maybe of yarn in it out of a 100-gram skein of DK light worsted weight yarn. So it's not going to take a long time. What I love is the challenge of finding a stitch pattern that I think is going to be interesting, and then figuring out how am I, what sort of ribbing pattern is going to work with that, and how am I going to transition from the ribbing into the stitch pattern. So instead of just saying, here's the ribbing, that's done, now here's the body, that's done, and now here's the crown, that they're all flowing from one into the other, and they're all flowing in nicely. They transition nicely. And that was, that's always something I'm looking for with a hat. Figuring out a nice way to do the crown decreases so everything comes together. So let's go to the overhead, and I'll show you this hat up close and tell you a little bit about the stitch pattern, where I got it from, and some other things that are related to that. So let's go to the overhead. So I made a hat in the past week. I actually designed a hat and knit it. And I quite like it. There are some things that I want to experiment with to do differently. I made this double length of ribbing because I knew there'd be plenty of yarn, and I designed it so that the ribbing would flow into the stitch pattern, but when you have this flipped up, you can't really tell that. So I think it would be better if it was double thick and maybe started with a provisional cast on or a regular cast on and then and sew it on the inside. But if you started with a provisional cast on, you could use a 3-needle join at the last round. So you'd still have that double thickness, but then you'd be able to see it. So mostly what I was interested in doing was seeing if I could find something besides a slip stitch pattern that would work well with some of the variegated yarn that Arcane Fibre Works sent me back in, I think it was November. So he sent me like 25 skeins of yarn. Some is fingering, some is DK, and some is Aran. The DK weight is like a heavy DK, light worsted weight. So the first couple of hats I was using slip stitch patterns because that can be a way to break up variegated colors in case there's pooling or flashing, because you can never tell by looking at a skein of variegated yarn how it's actually going to play out. But Arcane does a pretty good job of distributing the colors so that you don't get flashing and pooling, at least in the circumferences that I have been knitting with, because if you're knitting flat versus in the round, the yarn's going to play out differently. If you're knitting a large circumference versus a small circumference, it's going to play out differently as well. So I was kind of tired of just doing slip stitch patterns, so I pulled out this book. This is one of Barbara Walker's treasuries. It's her third treasury of knitting patterns. The first one was published in 1969, I think the second in 1970. This one was published in 1972. And the first two were all written instructions assuming that you were knitting flat. And what she did in this book was to create charted knitting patterns. She created a system of charts. Now, charts existed at this time, but they weren't used very much. They were mostly used for color work or sometimes lace. I have this book here, this first book of modern lace knitting. This is a Dover production, which means it's a replica production. So they took something that was out of print and then they reprinted it later. So this was originally published in 1953, and it has written instructions. You can see the sea of written instructions here. This instruction for one round, you know, they've got all of these abbreviations and a lot of things that are repeating, and it's very easy to look at your instruction, go to your knitting, do the thing, and then jump down to the wrong row. So I find written lace instructions really hard to read, but she also has charted instructions as well. So these are the kinds of charts that you might see in previous decades. What Barbara Walker did was come up with a whole bunch of symbols to mean different things, including cables. So this was something new, and she was doing this on graph paper with like pen or pencil. Which would have been what somebody at home who was using, coming up with things would have available to them as well. Nobody had a computer yet. They certainly didn't have a computer that had a program installed that would allow you to do stitch charts. The programs that are used today to do stitch charts, like the one I use, Stitch Mastery, uses a lot of these kinds of symbols, especially for cables that Barbara Walker developed. So she's still assuming that this is knit flat because we've got right side rows. You know, when the right side is facing you, you're going to be working in this direction. And then when the wrong side is facing you, you're going to be working in that direction. I can still use the same exact chart if I'm knitting in the round. So I thought, well, this has a lot of potential. It's a pretty simple stitch pattern, which is something I need with variegated yarn, because if you have anything complex, it could get really muddy that you just wouldn't even see it. And it had a lot of purl stitches in the background. When you have different colors that are in purl stitches, the color gets broken up a bit more. So let me see if I can find right here, like this orange stitch right here. You see this blip right here, and then this one here and this one here. Those are the same stitch. That's the head of the stitch and that's the running threads. In order for stitches to be connected vertically, you have to connect a stitch to the stitch below and a stitch up the stitch above. So the head of this stitch right underneath it right here, those are the running threads of the stitch above it. And then this right here is the head of the stitch below this orange one. And then we have the orange running threads. So it can really kind of break up color. This might be annoying if you're working in solid colors and you switch from one color to another and you get those blips on the right side of your fabric when you're working in purl stitches. That can be annoying, but in something like this, it can work out. They look like cables. They're not. They're mock cables. So cables are worked by crossing stitches over each other. So if I was working this as a cable and on the background of purl stitches, I'd have a purl stitch here and there'd be 2 knit stitches there, and I would cross the 2 knit stitches over the purl stitches. So they would change positions. And that would help, that would be what would cause this to move to the left. And in order to move to the right, then we would have 2 knit stitches crossing 1 purl stitch. They cross over this, and then they would switch places, and that's how you could get it to go to the right. The thing about cables is that it changes your gauge. Because stitches are crossing over each other, that tends to pull the fabric in, and it also makes it less stretchy. Mock cables are done with a combination of increasing and decreasing. So you increase on one side of the fabric and then you decrease on the other. So in this case, if I wanted something to go this way, I'd increase over here, but I would decrease over here. So I have the same result as a purl stitch moving locations, but without actually crossing them. And so you get a gauge that's exactly the same as it would be with regular stockinette, but you can get some of the effects of cables. The first year that I was doing Technique Tuesday videos, I did a video on mock cables and showed a variety of different ways that you could do them. And I made these hats, and then I ended up releasing these as a pattern a couple of years ago. I also wrote an article for Interweave Knits back then. They tend to publish the articles as a blog post at some point after they're published. I explained how you could add mock cables to a stockinette fabric to get that cable effect without changing the gauge. And so if you're interested in reading that article, I'll leave a link to that down below. I'm assuming it still exists. Then I'll also link to the hat pattern if you're interested. It's called Mock Me Gently. And these are 2 different variations on the same kind of thing. You can see in this one, the cables are just solid, and over here, and that has to do with the kind of increase I use, like a regular make 1 increase, where over here I use yarn overs and it created a more lacy effect. One of the things that was interesting to me about this pattern is that she had the increases and the decreases on different rows. So she had you do an increase here, which is going to increase your stitch count by 1 for each repeat. And then the next round or row, she would have you do the decrease. I'm not sure why she did that. And I don't know what effect it actually has on the way that these ropes look. When I did these kinds of mock cables, I was doing the increases and the decreases on the same row. So that is going to be something that I'm interested in comparing, is doing them on the same round and then on the next round just working stitches as they present, and see if that really has any effect at all on this snaking. I also want to compare it to actually using cable crossings, and just to see how much that does affect the gauge as well as the stretchability of the fabric. That would be an important thing to know. I thought this was an interesting experiment, and one of the things that I like about what happens with the stitch pattern up at the crown is that sometimes you can get kind of a gathered effect when you're doing your decreases at the crown. It's not as smooth as you might like, and so it kind of looks gathered. And what I like about this stitch pattern is that it behaves more like ribbing. So the knits are coming above and the purls are receding, and that helps to bring the stitches together and without it being gathered. And I like that as well. Now, when I posted a picture of this hat on Instagram, somebody asked if I was going to publish a pattern for it. And I am thinking of it. I think it might be a little while before I do that, because there are things that I want to tweak and I want to experiment with to see what's going to work. And I also have to think about the knitter who would be following these instructions. And what is going to happen if somebody has a very, very different row gauge, or what happens if they want it in a different size. I have to think through that kind of stuff. It's a very different process than saying, I have this yarn, this stitch pattern, and this gauge, and I want to make this specific size. How can I make that work? That's very different from thinking about how can I make this work with multiple sizes, or with different row gauges, or in different stitch counts. So that's something that I have to think through too, just as I'm thinking about design modifications as well that I might potentially want to make to this hat. It's February 2nd today, which means that Finish It February officially started yesterday. So if you're new here and you don't know what Finish It February is, it is an opportunity to address your pile of UFOs, your unfinished objects, and to make some decisions about them. So what I typically recommend is you take all of them out so that you know what they are, because a lot of times you forget things exist and you can't make decisions about things that you don't know exist. So you go through them one at a time. Do I still like this? Do I want to finish this? Will I use this when it's finished, or will somebody else use it when it's finished? And that goes into the yay pile. Then if you see something that you hate, you don't want to finish it, you never want to see it again, then that goes into the nay pile. So anything in the nay pile has automatically reduced the size of your UFO pile. And you can make some decisions about them now or later, or as part of your Finish It February routine. Some people like to just rip everything out, frog it, and wind it all back up into yarn and put it back in their stash. Some people throw it away. Some people donate it as is to the Goodwill. Some people sell it or trade it or whatever. You can do all kinds of, you can turn it into something else if that's something that feeds you creatively. But then there's the pile of ambiguity, and that's what I want to talk about today. Those are the things that you have ambiguous feelings about. And it's going to be different for everyone. Everyone's different. What I have found is that by pulling everything out every year and looking at it, those items in the pile of ambiguity become less ambiguous. And it's because I'm confronted with them every year, and I can see if my feelings for that thing have changed over time. Maybe I become inspired to turn it into something. Oh, I have this idea for felted mittens. I could, felt that fabric, turn it into mittens, and I'm good to go. Maybe you just want to rip it out, or you don't even like the yarn anymore, and so you decide you are going to donate it. Or maybe it's like, well, I thought I liked that sweater when I started knitting it 15 years ago, but that's not really my style, and it's not going to fit me, and I don't really like that color anyway. So, over time, just by exposing yourself to it year after year, they become less ambiguous. And for me, they often ended up in the nay pile. They ended up, I don't want anything more to do with this. And I did different things with them depending on what it was for. Sometimes you can have ambiguous feelings about things because maybe the person you were knitting it for isn't in your life anymore. Maybe they died. Maybe you just grew apart, you don't see them anymore. It could be all kinds of reasons. So you have these ambiguous feelings that you put all of this work into this thing and that person's not here anymore, and you feel like, well, now I've wasted all this work on this person, and that may be tugging at your feelings too. Sometimes things are just so far along that you feel like you've invested too much to quit, but you don't like it. And you feel like all of that time is going to be lost if you don't finish it. So if you haven't heard of this before, the sunk cost fallacy, that is what you're dealing with. The idea that you have too much invested to quit. You're looking at how much time you've invested in it previously, rather than realizing that time is gone no matter what happens next. And the decision you have to make is, how do I want to spend my time going forward? And does any of that time want to be spent on this thing that you may not like anymore? I have fallen for this sunk cost fallacy a couple of times with some knitting projects. And one was when I found it 15 years after I'd knit all of the pieces of a sweater. And I had no memory of knitting it. And I thought, well, maybe someday I'll sew it together. It was lovely. It just wasn't something I thought I would wear. It wasn't a color I thought I would wear. And there was all those pieces. And so I kept it. And I kept it for another 5 years or another 10. No, it was another 10 years. And that was when I started doing Finish It February. And I finally, after a couple of years, thought, you know what? I've got this long-term project I'm working on where I'm knitting a sweater from each decade, from the 1890s to the 1990s. This would be perfect for the 1990s. I wouldn't have to knit anything new because it's already all knit. I just have to sew it together and do the button band. It'll be great. And so I was okay with, oh, I'm not going to wear this because it was for part of this project, where some of the sweaters I've knit for that project I knew I wasn't going to wear. And it was while I was trying to sew it together that I realized why this had gotten shoved to the side so many years ago, and why I must have gotten so discouraged, and that's why I put it away. And that's the problem with putting things away for years and years and years, is that you forget sometimes why they got put away. You just say, well, I wonder why I put this away. This is great. And then you start working on it and you start seeing where the trouble was. And for me, the trouble was that it had stitch patterns that needed to be symmetrical on either side of the cardigan and met up at the shoulder, and none of the pieces matched at the shoulder, and they didn't match where they were splitting at the V. And it was it was because I was doing it based on measurements for every piece. Every piece, when it got to be this long, then I was doing the next thing, rather than knitting the first piece, knitting measurements, and knitting the subsequent ones by going on row count. And so in order for me to actually end up with that completed sweater, I would have had to rip out both of the fronts down to below the V-neck and re-knit them. And that was a point where I said, that is too much time. I'm not spending that on this sweater. If all I had to do was spend a couple hours sewing it up and doing a button bend, I was okay with it, even though I wasn't going to wear it, but not having to do all that work. But that is one of the problems of putting things away for so long, is that you don't remember what caused you to put it to the side, especially if you really love it every time you see it. It's like, I don't know why I didn't finish that. I really like it. And sometimes it was so long ago that your knitting skills are so much better now. And you look at this and you think, oh my God, how am I going to reconcile the part that I've already knit with my old skills with the part I'm going to knit with my new skills? So sometimes you make that leap when I'm going to finish this, and then you realize, I don't want to finish this, and it ends up in the knit pile. So I'd be interested to know if you have a pile of ambiguity and what it is that you think caused it to go into that pile and not into the yay or nay pile. A couple of weeks ago, I told you what I was going to be working on for Finish It February, and I want to give you a little bit of a progress update on how things are going. So let's go to the overhead. So a few years ago, when I was working on my project to knit a sweater from each decade, I discovered that in the 1960s and 70s, I think even into the 80s, there were these sweater kits that you could buy that would have a pattern in it. It would have all of the yarn you needed to knit the sweater. It would have buttons and grosgrain ribbon for cardigans. And then it would have what's called a skirt length of wool fabric. Now this fabric is hand woven in the border counties of the UK, so along the Scotland-England border, where there's all this traditional weaving culture, and that's how these kits were formed. And so I found out about them, and I thought, I want to see if I can get some of those kits, because I hadn't been able to knit with any vintage yarn. I was knitting these things from all these different decades, having to figure out yarn substitutions, and I just thought, what an ideal way of doing a project for this. So one of the kits I got had this beautiful fabric and this kind of blue fabric, a blue color yarn right here. I made the sweater, and I was afraid to make the skirt. The fabric, you can see kind of at the edge of the fabric where, that was the end of the length of fabric I had. It's kind of shredding. And I had never sewn with wool fabric before. Everybody say, oh, it's so easy, but I was really worried about this shredding. And that's because of the kind of woven fabric it is. It isn't fulled like other wool fabrics where you can just cut it and the edges aren't going to fray. Also, I had 1 yard and 3/4, which is about 1.6 meters of fabric that was 28 inches wide. And I have plaids. So I wanted there to be pattern matching, and I didn't know how to do it, and I was afraid of screwing up. I tried all different kinds of things to try to figure out how I could do this. I was watching videos, I was reading things. I'm perfectly comfortable with written instructions most of the time, but this was just a situation that I felt like it's not going to be in the pattern. This is something you need to learn, And I think you have to do a little failing in order to learn sometimes. Like you follow the instructions, but you didn't realize you also needed to do this other thing. So I went to a fabric store in St. Paul. That's where I usually get, it's where I got the buttons for that 1960s sweater. They were vintage 60s buttons. And they recommended that I could do a mock-up like this, like I'd done with the muslin, but with some like just plaid flannel. So I bought the flannel and then I never practiced with it. I was just too scared, and it's been 2 years. So like I'm not afraid to follow a sewing pattern. What I was nervous about was doing something that isn't in the pattern, that you have to know how to do this. And the pattern matching thing, just I couldn't really comprehend it. So I signed up for a sewing class at that shop where I bought the fabric and had gotten those buttons. And I started it a couple of weeks ago. And so she showed me how to do the pattern matching with this. So we cut out, first of all, she fitted this to me to make sure that it fit me right. And then she helped me lay this out. And one of the things that she was showing was she's like, oh, this is kind of askew, when she was, jerking on the fabric to get it straightened out, which I wasn't doing. I was just laying the thing on and trying to work with it. And so, just little, she would tell me to do something and then she'd go, oh, but you have to do this. So I learned a lot. So I cut that out. And then last week was a skip week and I hadn't done anything. I wanted to cut out the lining because this is going to need a lining as well. The wool fabric will. So I cut out the lining for this and the lining for the blue fabric, and marked the darts where the darts will be in the lining. And then I cut out the fabric for my blue plaid. And first of all, it was so much easier because I had to practice, but also because this fabric was just straight. It's 50 years old or more, and it was just straight. It was just very easy to do it. The tricky part was that I only had 28 inches in width. And the back is seamed because there's a zipper up the back. The front is folded, so it was easy to get the front to fit on the 28-inch wide. But for this, I had to get the back seam centered on one of these blue lines, and then the other back seam had to get centered on a blue line. It couldn't be the same one because there was seam allowance. So they had to be spread apart, and then I think the back is just slightly wider and just the fact that it has a seam in it where the front piece doesn't. So it barely fit. I've got this intended to have a little bit more of the edge where the zipper is going to be. And I had it just missed it right here. But I did get it cut out. And the way that we're dealing with the fact that this fabric can kind of shred is we're doing what she calls flat lining. So I've got so I'm going to be sewing the lining, sewing the two pieces together, the lining to the wool fabric, and then I can just use it as one piece of fabric. And I have the darts marked on the lining fabric so that I can create the darts through both pieces, or through both layers. So very happy, making progress. I will have this done by the end of the month. Having my hand held through it, I'm very excited. Pretty much every year, I'm also using Finish Up February to fix things or modify things. And this is a sweater that I knit for my nephew 35 years ago. It has this hole in it. And my brother asked me, do you think you can fix it? Because his granddaughter is ready to be able to wear this. I said, sure. And it took me a while to find some yarn that would work well. I thought about doing visible mending. I really didn't want to go off script in terms of the original design. I didn't want to do visible mending. I didn't want to, make some kind of giant triangle on top of that. I didn't want to do that. That's something that somebody else might choose to do. I just didn't want to do that. So I decided I would do as close to invisible mending as I could. There's techniques to do this. I just don't do this stuff very often, very rarely. And the technique that I was thinking I was going to use for this, I have in one of my antique books. I'm sure I could find it online somewhere as well, but I have it in one of this Encyclopedia of Needlework. It's got all kinds of needlework, and it's got knitting in here. including some really cool sock heels that I haven't seen before, so which I want to try, and sock toes. But they also have this section on repairing knitting, so that the pictures are always not on the same page as the instructions. So the method that I was thinking of doing is this one. So you've got live loops up here and live loops down here. And then you cut it along the sides. These flaps get folded under and tacked down so that you don't have any live stitches at the edges. If you've ever seen those Instagram reels where they're repairing stuff, they are doing this, but they're not showing you that they've done this and folded it back and tacked it. It's one of the things that annoys me about those, is they're not showing you the other side. And you think, oh, this is magic, I could do that. Well, not if you don't know about that. So once you get this set up, then there's a couple of ways that you can set up your like warp threads or weft threads or whatever for building new foundation stitches around it. So I was looking at these and I realized I had a problem. I did not have a few extra spare stitches that I could then fold under. And that's because this is in Intarsia. You know, this rip comes right up to that one last stitch in blue. I don't have extra stitches to release and fold under. If this was a hole that was in here, I could use that technique. So I have another idea. It's one that I've used before. I'm probably going to practice it on a swatch to make sure that I can make it look nice. What I will do is, I'll probably come down to about here. I will pick up stitches through the fabric. I don't do it by like up here coming up through the head of a stitch. I do it through the center of the stitch so that the new stitch comes out of that. It's kind of like grafting on the bottom in a way. And then knit up to here and then graft it to the top. And what I'm not sure about is how I'm going to handle the edges. I have some ideas about how I might do that, but I'm going to practice it on some swatches first and see if my idea will work and where I can make it look nice. So yeah, that's probably what I'm going to do, is pick up stitches all the way across all of the blue stitches, knit up all the way up, and then graft it on top of that. And then I also do something to stabilize all of these stitches so that they aren't going to continue to come out. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.